Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you the most insane story of my entire life. A story that involves art, Paris, classical sculptures, and the biggest professional misunderstanding I've ever experienced. This is the story of how I became the Louvre's so-called body pose consultant and learned the hard way that when you work with models recreating classical art poses, people have very different interpretations of what adjusting positions actually means. Spoiler alert, when you tell someone to arch their back more while they're posing as Venus de Milo, things can get really awkward really fast. So here's how this whole mess started. I was living in Paris, completely broke, with about 40 euros in my bank account and a degree in art history that was proving absolutely useless in the real world. I'd been applying to every museum job I could find, and finally, I got a call back from the Louvre. They said they had an unusual position available and wanted to interview me. I was beyond excited. I mean, it's the Louvre, the most famous museum in the world. I pictured myself giving elegant tours, discussing the Mona Lisa with sophisticated visitors, maybe wearing a cute beret. The universe had very different plans for me. I showed up for the interview in my best outfit, portfolio in hand, ready to impress. The hiring manager, a very serious French woman named Madame Dubois, looked at my resume and said in this heavy accent, "So, you studied classical sculpture, yes?" I nodded enthusiastically. She continued, "We have a new educational program. We need someone to work with live models who recreate classical poses for our students and visitors. You would be the pose consultant, making sure the models accurately represent the sculptures." I thought that sounded amazing. Art history meets practical application. I accepted immediately. My first day, they took me to this gorgeous studio space in one of the museum's back rooms. There were mirrors everywhere, excellent lighting, and right in the center was a platform. Madame Dubois explained, "The models will arrive, you will direct them into the poses of famous sculptures, make adjustments as needed, and visitors will sketch them. Simple, yes?" I said yes. Nothing about this was going to be simple. The first model arrived. Her name was Amélie, a stunning woman in her late 20s with the kind of bone structure that belonged in a museum itself. She walked in wearing a silk robe, and I suddenly realized something Madame Dubois had failed to mention. I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, what exactly will the models be wearing for these poses?" Amélie laughed and said, "Nothing, obviously. We're recreating classical sculptures. They were all nude." My face went completely red. She added, "You didn't know? Oh, this will be fun." I tried to be professional. I really did. I pulled up a reference image of the Venus de Milo on my tablet and said, "Okay, so we're starting with this one. If you could just position yourself like this." Amélie dropped the robe without any hesitation whatsoever and stood there completely naked, waiting for direction. I was absolutely panicking inside, but trying to maintain this air of professional detachment. I said, "Right, so one arm needs to come up like it's holding something that's no longer there, and the other arm—" She interrupted, "You're going to have to touch me to position me correctly. That's literally your job." I had not mentally prepared for this aspect of the position. I approached her very carefully, hands shaking slightly, and tried to adjust her arm position. I kept saying things like, "Just a bit higher," and "rotate your shoulder slightly this way," while simultaneously trying not to make eye contact and also trying to actually look at what I was doing. It was the most professionally awkward experience of my life. Then she said, "My hips aren't right, are they? You need to adjust those too." I looked at the reference image. She was right. Her weight distribution was completely wrong. I took a deep breath and placed my hands on her hips, trying to shift them into the correct position. That's when the first tour group walked in. A dozen art students with their instructor filed into the room, and there I was, hands on a naked woman's hips, clearly flustered, while she stood there completely comfortable and amused by my discomfort. The instructor, an older British man, raised an eyebrow and said, "Ah, the new pose consultant. Carry on."
I wanted to die. I wanted the floor of this famous museum to open up and swallow me whole. But I had to carry on, because this was literally my job now. Over the next hour, I adjusted angles, repositioned limbs, and said phrases I never thought I'd say in a professional context, like, "Your weight needs to shift more to your left buttock," and "the curve of your spine isn't quite matching the marble." Emily found the whole thing hilarious. At one point, she whispered, "You know, most pose consultants are much more confident with the touching." I whispered back, "Most pose consultants probably didn't find out about the nudity situation 5 minutes before their first model arrived." The second day brought a male model named Philippe. If I thought Emily was intimidating, Philippe was on another level entirely. This man looked like he'd been carved by Michelangelo himself. When Madame Dubois told me we'd be recreating David's pose, I nearly quit on the spot. Philippe arrived, we discussed the pose, he disrobed, and I found myself having to direct a naked Greek god through the specifics of contrapposto stance. I had to adjust the angle of his hips. I had to make sure his weight was properly on one leg. I had to position his arms correctly. And the entire time, a group of elderly American tourists was sketching him while occasionally glancing at me like I had the best job in the world or the worst job in the world, depending on their perspective. But here's where things got really complicated. After about a week of working with various models on classical poses, people started requesting specific sculptures. And some of these sculptures were, let's say, more intimate than Venus de Milo. Someone requested The Kiss by Rodin. Do you know what that sculpture depicts? Two people in a very passionate embrace. The museum approved it because technically it's a famous artwork. They sent me 2 models, a man and a woman named Jean and Sophie, and told me to help them recreate the pose. I stood there with my reference images, looking at these 2 very attractive people, and realized I was going to have to direct them into an intimate embrace and then make adjustments to ensure artistic accuracy. Jean looked at me and said, "So, where do you want us?" I swallowed hard and said, "Okay, so John, you're going to sit here, and Sophie, you're going to sit on his lap, facing him, and then you'll both lean in like you're about to kiss, but not actually kissing." They got into position. It was already incredibly awkward. Then I had to make adjustments. I circled around them, checking angles against the sculpture, and realized Sophie's back needed to arch more. I said, "Sophie, can you arch your back a bit more?" She tried, but it wasn't quite right. She said, "You might need to guide me. Put your hand on my lower back and show me how much." So there I was, placing my hand on this woman's bare back while she sat on another man's lap, trying to get the exact curve that Rodin had captured in marble over a century ago. Jean was trying not to laugh. Sophie was completely professional about it. I was having an out-of-body experience. But it got worse. I noticed John's hand placement was wrong. In the sculpture, his hand is on her thigh, pulling her closer. In their pose, his hand was just sort of hovering awkwardly. I said, "Jean, your hand needs to actually be on her thigh, and you need to look like you're pulling her toward you." He raised an eyebrow and said, "You want me to grab her thigh?" I looked at the sculpture again. I looked at them. I said, "Yes, that's literally what the sculpture shows." Sophie shrugged and said, "He's right, that's the pose." So John placed his hand on her thigh, and suddenly this educational art recreation started looking much less educational and much more like something else entirely. A group of Japanese tourists walked in at exactly that moment. They took one look at the scene, started giggling, took a bunch of photos, and left. The sketching instructor tried to maintain order, telling his students to focus on the lines and composition, but even he looked flustered. I stood there with my tablet, double-checking measurements and angles, wondering how my art history degree had led me to this exact moment in time. The following week, someone requested The Rape of Proserpina by Bernini.
For those who don't know, it's a sculpture depicting Pluto grabbing Proserpina, and you can see his fingers pressing into her thigh in the marble. It's an incredibly powerful piece about force and resistance. It's also nearly impossible to recreate without it looking absolutely insane out of context.
When Madame Dubois told me this was the next pose, I actually laughed. I thought she was joking. She was not joking. They sent me two models, Marcus and Isabel. I explained the pose, showed them the references, and watched as Isabel's face went from professional interest to, wait, what? Marcus, who was apparently a very experienced art model, just nodded and said, I've done this one before. It's all about the grip and the angles. I didn't even know what to say to that. We began positioning them. Marcus had to lift Isabel, one arm around her waist, one hand on her thigh, while she had to arch away from him with her arms outstretched. The whole thing required me to constantly adjust grips, weight distribution, and body angles. At one point, I had to tell Marcus, your hand needs to actually press into her thigh more. In the sculpture, you can see the indentation in the marble. He looked at me and said, you want me to grab her thigh harder? I looked at Bernini's masterpiece on my tablet and said, yes, that's literally what makes this sculpture famous, the realism of the flesh. So he did. And Isabel, completely professional, adjusted her expression to match Proserpina's shock and resistance in the sculpture. Meanwhile, I'm walking around them with a measuring tape, checking proportions, looking like some kind of bizarre director of the world's most uncomfortable theater production. A school group walked in, high school students, maybe 16 or 17 years old, with their very flustered teacher. The teacher took one look at the scene and tried to quickly usher the students back out, but they were already sketching, already asking questions like, is this appropriate? And why is he grabbing her like that? I had to step in and explain in my broken French that this was a recreation of a Bernini sculpture from 1622, that it depicted a mythological scene, that this was high art and educational. The teacher did not look convinced. The students looked way too interested. But the absolute peak of chaos came when a wealthy American couple commissioned a private session. They paid a lot of money to have models recreate a series of romantic sculptures for their anniversary, and they wanted me to direct the poses while they watched. The couple, probably in their 60s, sat in chairs with champagne while I worked with two models named Alexandra and Camille through increasingly intimate classical poses. We did Apollo and Daphne. We did Cupid and Psyche. We did several others that I've honestly tried to block from my memory. At one point, the American woman, slightly drunk on champagne, called out, "Can you make them get closer?"
More passion! I tried to explain that I was following the classical sculptures, but she insisted, "We're paying for this! Make it more romantic!" So I found myself directing Alexandra to gaze more longingly, and Camille to lean in more suggestively, while staying true to the artistic references. The whole thing felt like I was directing some kind of very weird, very expensive, very classical softcore performance art. The husband kept making comments like, "Now that's what I call art," and "Honey, maybe we should take up sculpting," while his wife fanned herself dramatically. Alexandra and Camille were absolute professionals, maintaining their poses and expressions perfectly, but I could see Alexandra trying not to laugh every time I had to give increasingly absurd directions like "more yearning in your eyes" or "arch your back as if you're being pulled by divine forces." After about 3 months of this job, I'd worked with dozens of models, recreated probably 50 different classical sculptures, and completely desensitized myself to nudity in an art context. What started as the most awkward situation of my life became almost routine. I could position naked strangers into complex poses while discussing contrapposto and weight distribution without even blushing. I'd become fluent in phrases like, "Your gluteus maximus needs to engage more," and "the torsion in your torso isn't matching the Hellenistic period aesthetic." But I learned some valuable lessons along the way. First lesson, always ask about the full details of a job before accepting it. If someone says you'll be a pose consultant, ask what exactly you'll be consulting on. Second lesson, classical art is beautiful but incredibly awkward to recreate with actual human beings. What looks elegant in marble can look absolutely bizarre when you're directing two naked people to embrace in front of a tour group.
Third lesson, art models are some of the most professional, chill people on the planet. They made what could have been impossibly uncomfortable into just a regular work environment. Fourth lesson, context is everything. The same pose that's considered a priceless masterpiece when it's carved in marble becomes questionable when it's two living humans in a museum studio. Fifth lesson, French people are way more comfortable with nudity than Americans, and watching American tourists react to the sessions was honestly more entertaining than the actual posing. Sixth lesson, you can get used to almost anything if you do it enough times. By month 3, I was having casual conversations with naked models about lunch plans while adjusting their hip angles without even thinking about it. The job ended after 6 months when the program's funding ran out. Madame Dubois told me I'd done excellent work and that the program had been very popular, perhaps too popular, as some visitors were coming specifically for the live model sessions rather than for the actual sculptures.
She gave me a stellar recommendation letter that I'm honestly not sure how to use because skilled at directing nude models into classical art poses is not a normal resume bullet point. I went back to job hunting, but now I had this bizarre experience that I couldn't quite figure out how to explain in interviews. When potential employers asked about my time at the Louvre, I'd say I worked in educational programming and leave it at that. If they pressed for details, I'd mention classical art recreation and hope they didn't ask for specifics. One interviewer did ask for specifics. I explained the whole thing, and I could see him trying so hard not to laugh. I didn't get that job. Eventually, I found work at a much more conventional museum, doing much more conventional tours, where everyone stays fully clothed and I don't have to touch anyone. It's nice, it's calm, it's completely drama-free. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the absolute chaos of those 6 months. There was something uniquely hilarious about working a job where my daily tasks included things like make sure the muscle definition in the model's back matches Michelangelo's anatomical accuracy, and adjust the passionate embrace angle by 3 degrees to the left. The models I worked with still send me messages sometimes. Emily, my first model, got married last year and invited me to the wedding. Philippe started his own figure modeling school and asked me to consult on pose accuracy. Alexandra and Camille actually started dating after working together on all those romantic sculptures, and they credit me with bringing them together, which is both sweet and absolutely ridiculous. John sends me memes about awkward work situations, and Sophie became a successful artist herself, creating sculptures based on her experiences as a model. Looking back, it was one of the strangest periods of my life, but also one of the most educational. I learned more about classical art, human anatomy, and professional boundaries than I ever could have in a classroom. I learned that art and awkwardness often go hand in hand. I learned that what seems impossibly uncomfortable at first can become just another day at work. And I learned that somewhere in Paris, there's probably still a rumor about the extremely awkward American who became the Louvre's pose consultant and spent 6 months looking perpetually flustered while directing naked people. So that's my story, everyone. The completely true tale of how I became the Louvre's body pose consultant and discovered that classical art recreation is significantly more hands-on than I ever imagined. If you enjoyed this story about professional awkwardness meeting high art, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and tell me in the comments, what's the most awkward job you've ever had? Or have you ever had a work experience where the reality was completely different from what you expected? I want to hear your stories. Until next time, remember, always read the fine print on job descriptions. Classical art is beautiful but complicated, and sometimes the best stories come from the jobs that make you question all your life choices. Thanks for watching, and may your career path be slightly less naked than mine was. Bye!